How do you tame your curiosity and limit your questions when talking to a man who sings opera, speaks 5 languages, consults with hundreds of organizations ranging among the fields of education, financial services, beauty and fashion, nonprofits, and the arts? This was our task when interviewing Dr. Derrick Gay on the topic of helping school communities flourish. We reined ourselves in and focused our discussion on the guiding question of what pathways should school communities follow as they seek to flourish in terms of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Dr. Gay unpacked several topics, including current trends in international schools in terms of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, DIB, defining and sometimes redefining the terms diversity, inclusion, and belonging, approaches to use in order to encourage buy-in and minimize pushback within school communities, action steps that schools can take around the interconnection between dignity, respect, inclusion, and belonging, including restorative justice practices. Building a culture of belonging in international schools, which tend to have higher student and staff turnover than home country schools. Thoughts about schools of education and how they can offer DIB learning opportunities. This episode was recorded on July 18th, 2024. We now give you Dr. Derrick Gay, an educator and artist who flexes his character strengths of creativity, fairness, perspective, and social intelligence during this important conversation with us.
Hi, Dr. Gay. Welcome. We're so excited to have you here on Educators Going Global. And we'll start with asking, where in the world are you? And you had a little story about that. Would you like to tell that?
Where in the world am I? Well, right now I'm in New York City. Where am I supposed to be? I'm supposed to be in Chicago. I was here doing some wonderful work. I teach in the Klingenstein program at Columbia University, and we had 2 wonderful days with the students, and I was meant to go home, and Mother Nature had a different understanding of where I should be. So storms have kept me here, but here in New York, on my way to Chicago, but very happy to be here with you all today.
Well, we are blessed to have you and feeling very grateful that we were able to find a time to connect. One thing that we like to start our podcast with is a going global story. Have you got one you'd like to share with us?
The going global story. I have so many stories. I think one story I could share is just a recent story. So I feel very fortunate because of my work to travel all around the world. Last year, we calculated some numbers. I traveled to 23 countries and 45 cities during the 23-24
Wow.
academic year. So if you're wondering, yes, I have lots of miles. But one story that just happened recently was I was working in Barcelona with the American School of Barcelona, and I have some great friends there that I've known for 25 years since I've been going to Barcelona, and we were hanging out, and we were making this wonderful paella at their place, as one does when one is in Barcelona. And I came in, and their parents were there, whom I hadn't seen in about 10 years, and I walked into the door, and as I'm wearing now, but you can't see, I was wearing a Brazilian jersey. My friends are Spaniards and their parents are from Argentina. And I walked in and the mother had a hug and she took it back. And she said, I'm not going to hug you until you take your jersey off. And it was a big joke because I also had an Argentine Messi jersey and I put the shirt on and we were all happy. One big happy Argentine, American, Brazilian, Spanish family having paella. So that's my glowing global story that many of us who are navigating these international waters have the pleasure of also having fun about our backgrounds and sharing wonderful meals together.
That's an awesome story.
It is. Wow, I'm glad you were able to stay fully clothed. That would have been not so great to be shirtless. I was just in southern Spain a few weeks ago, and when I went out to all the restaurants, all the men were wearing shirts, very nice shirts.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's part of the custom there, Dr. Gay. Well, that's cool. And I guess Spanish is one of your many languages that you speak. Yes, see?
Yes, so I speak English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. And I do work in those languages. And I also was fortunate, part of my background is as an opera singer. So I
Wow.
studied at Oberlin Conservatory. And as an opera singer, you learn certainly Italian and French and German. I do not count German as one of my languages, although I can read German and order wonderful things in German and speak operatic German, which doesn't get do much in real life to tell people about the war and the thunder and the flowers. But it's certainly been a wonderful asset to engaging in this work in international schools because depending on the country I'm in, I'm able to deliver not only in English but also in those languages, which has really, really helped.
That's huge. And especially when support staff come to the professional learning opportunities and you're speaking in their language if they don't speak English, that is so important.
Super important,
Super important.
including all adults in professional development. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a good lead in for where we're going to go with our chat today. So, one of the things I really found interesting on your site, which is very informative, is the focus on wellness, because wellness can cover so many different areas. And one of the things that Audrey and I really support is the positive psychology framework, the PERMA framework. It's a great way for schools to approach wellness for everybody. And you use the term flourish on your website, connecting to positive psychology, I think. So, with this in mind, here's our guiding question: what pathways should school communities follow as they seek to flourish in terms of diversity, inclusion, and belonging? So, huge question. And we're going to start off because our focus is with international schools with a sub question of, with your involvement supporting international schools, what trends are you seeing in terms of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in these international schools?
Yeah, so I will begin just by saying that one trend that we're seeing is that international schools are having this conversation. And it's interesting. So, 2015, I was invited to give a keynote at the AAIE conference, so the Association for the Advancement of International Education. And I was super excited and I arrived. Again, this is leaders from all around the world coming together to support professional development, to better serve our students and better serve our schools. And I was meant to speak on diversity. I spoke for about an hour and there were great questions. But what was clear to me was that while people really appreciated the talk, it wasn't something that they saw as particularly relevant to international schools. Why? Because there's this sense that in international schools, because we have lots of passport holders and lots of people from different nationalities, that we're international, that we conflate that with having inclusive communities, meaning that the presence of lots of differences means that we are inclusive. And of course, that's a fallacy, and the research would find, in fact, that the more different types of people that you have, the greater intentionality that you're going to need around bringing people together around common language and common goals. So, fast forward 2020, George Floyd happens in the United States, the murder of George Floyd, this watershed moment, not only in the United States, but around the world, of just that there are issues, there are ongoing issues. There's racial injustice, there's other forms of just injustices happening, not only in the United States, but around the world, that there are issues. That was super important for international schools to begin to think about what are the local issues here outside of the United States that we need to address, and how are individuals, constituents, students, faculty, staff, parents, all constituents in our school, how are they describing their sense of belonging? So the first trend that we're seeing in international schools is that we're having the conversation and that we're engaging in the efforts, and we understand that this is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. This is a world issue of this idea of fostering a better world, of deepening inclusion and belonging all, and for schools so that all students are able to thrive and flourish. So that's definitely one of the trends. A second trend is just that there's an awareness around this in international schools, but we're also realizing that currently perhaps all our schools don't have the internal expertise that we need, and or the systems and the infrastructure and the policies to really drive the work. So it's still very newish in international schools, not only to think about these issues, but then to intentionally integrate them into the DNA of our international schools. A third trend that I'm seeing is just around what this actually means when we're talking about diversity. And I have a TEDx talk where I talk about what I call the double edged sword of diversity, which is the notion that the word diversity often creates obstacles for or undermines the work of diversity because people understand it in very different ways and have very different understandings of what diversity means. And I'll share with you when I ask people in surveys, anonymous surveys, or in workshops, what they understand around diversity. It's fascinating. I asked them also if they support diversity. And again, larger people say they support the work. But when I asked them if they feel part of diversity, we get different responses. So, do you support diversity? Really high numbers. Do you feel included by the term diversity? Lower numbers. And why? Because people believe or associate diversity as a proxy for historically marginalized groups. And that looks different in different parts of the world. In the US, immediately people think about race, 100% race. And race in the US means Black people, Asian people, Hispanic, Latinx, Middle Eastern, anything that's not white. People immediately think that's what you mean when you mean diverse, and LGBTQ. So if you're not part of those groups, then you're not diverse, and this work doesn't necessarily include you, and you don't necessarily benefit from it. That's important. Internationally, people tend to think diversity equals LGBTQ. It's the first thing they think. And so you say we want to deepen diversity, and some people think you want to have advocacy around LGBTQ only, to the exclusion of advocacy around other issues, other groups, other challenges. So this framing is critical, this linguistic framing around advancing this work around flourishing and belonging, that we have similar understandings that diversity really is about everyone. Diversity means differences, not different. There isn't a normal group, and if you don't belong to that group, then you are the diverse group that we're speaking about. So that's important to broaden what we mean by diversity. And this doesn't mean that we're watering down the work. This doesn't mean that we're not going to address the huge issues that we have in our world and society around justice for everyone, around inclusion for everyone, that everyone deserves, everyone has the right to be seen as a human, and all of the rights that are associated with being a human. You shouldn't have to navigate stereotypes and assumptions and thoughts around criminality and being less than. No one should do this. So we still need to address those issues, but the way to do it is by including everyone initially in the conversation and including everyone in the work that we need to do together to make a better world for all of us.
That's just so beautiful and makes a lot of sense. So that's how you would define diversity, taking all kinds of different groups into consideration so that everybody's a part of it. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to look at inclusion and belonging in the same way and define them very specifically for our audience. And
Yeah.
I'm also wondering whether either of those terms should be redefined the way that you've just redefined diversity for us here.
Yeah. And more specifically, when I think about diversity, I think about really the full range of all of our differences. And everyone has these differences. And across all of those differences, the shared human characteristics that connect us. So it's a both and. It's inclusive of everyone and all of our differences, but we can't just say we're all different, so we're all separate, because we're all humans and that brings us together. So it's a wonderful metaphor of thinking about the interconnectedness of our individuality and our uniqueness. But then belonging is different. Belonging is this sense of connectedness. Belonging is this feeling, it's emotion really, that I have when people acknowledge my humanity, when people acknowledge my dignity being this inherent value that I have as a human, and no one has more or less than anyone else. And so when I feel that I am seen, that I am heard, that I'm valued, that I can contribute, that I have equal access, that I have this emotional, experiential outcome, that feeling is belonging. And that's really the goal. The goal is that in our schools, that certainly our students and everyone has this sense that they're being seen and heard and valued as a human just as much as anyone else. And then inclusion would be then the ways in which we acknowledge this dignity of others. It's the interpersonal behaviors. It's the my including you. It's my saying your name correctly. It's my teaching about your background, your values, your traditions. It's about seeing you as an intellectual equal. It's about ensuring that we have representation of folks in our classroom and that you matter, not treating someone better than you or worse than you. The ways in which we do that, those behaviors are called inclusion. And then that's at the interpersonal level. At the organizational level, that's also inclusion. But then that would be policies, that would be practices, that would be the nature of the curriculum, that would be institutional practices, that would be artifacts that show individuals that their dignity is being acknowledged. And so when you think about diversity, inclusion and belonging in that way, you can see a beautiful interplay of this idea of recognize the inherent value of all individuals, of all humans. No one is better than anyone else. And that's called dignity. And we want to be intentional in our behaviors and our actions that we're acknowledging folks. That is called inclusion, so that ultimately they have this sense of affirmation, and that's called belonging. But we know that also that we're humans and the world is not perfect and that there is bias, there is discrimination, there is racism, there is you name it, there's classism, there's heteronormativity, all of these things. And so we have to be intentional about combating these issues. And when we get it wrong or when we see that it isn't right, then we have to engage in restorative practices. We have to identify the harm. We have to then think about how do we do some education around helping people to be better and to be more aware such that their behaviors and our institutional behaviors align with this idea of belonging. So we recognize there's a theoretical framework and people aren't perfect and the world isn't perfect. So we have to track, we have to monitor, and we have to look at ourselves to do better because we know better.
My last segment of work as a school counselor was in elementary schools.
Mm,
And I would sit in classes and watch the teachers, maybe not using some of the words that you're offering, but forms of those words. The
yes,
very basic helping the children grow their awareness. And so part of the awareness is of themselves. And then the other aspect is of how they interact with others.
yes,
And to me, that's such a theme as we have different guests come on and talk about different DIJ programming. That part of it isn't complicated, but what you were saying at the very start about the concept like of diversity, that's going to take time with people, like you were sharing off mic. When you first meet with groups, they want, how do I do this? What do we do? Let's move forward. But you have to start with their conceptions and their preconceptions first. So, with my saying all that kind of framing before we get into this next question, looking at the big picture, how do you approach communities to encourage buy in and minimize pushback when you're coming in as the guru for DIB and they have their preconceptions, their stereotypical thoughts as well? How do you begin that process? Let's say it's a school community. How do you get it going and how do you minimize the pushback?
that's a great question. And part of it is by just in the beginning sort of conversations is framing the why. And I think we don't do a great job at this in schools around why we're engaging in this work. And often, if we don't do that, you mentioned one of the preconceived notions people might have is that this work is somehow political, that this work around creating an inclusive environment where all children and all folks in this school thrive is somehow political, because often it's framed in that way. So often when I begin to work with the school, one of the first things I do is to acknowledge the double-edged sort of diversity and to acknowledge sort of what the goals of the work are and why we're doing the work. At a school, we do the work because we know it's the right thing to do. I've never received pushback when I've said, we want to create a school community where your child thrives and where all children thrive. No one said, no, that's political. We also know that we do the work because it's aligned with the goals of education. It's not only just dissemination of information, it's also about fostering the whole child, that the child has a positive sense of themselves, that they're able to interact with others with respect and with empathy and kindness, that certainly they're getting some type of educational development around the content that they will need to be able to navigate the world, but also that we want them to really be thoughtful and informed citizens and have choice-filled lives. And again, when I share that as a goal of this work, nowhere in the world has a parent said, that doesn't make sense to me. That's political. We know we want all students to have an inclusive environment so they can learn and grow. We know the world that they're living in is composed of different types of people. We don't want them to be afraid of someone because they have a different religion. We don't want them to be afraid of someone because their family is composed differently to mine. We don't want them to be afraid of someone because they have a different skin color. And if they are, we know that that's also going to limit their choices moving forward. If you can't be roommates with someone in university because they're from a different background, you can't be in a study group with someone because they're from a different race or they speak a different language, you can't learn from a professor in university because you don't agree with them, you can't go off to your vocation or your career and only work with people who are just like you. It's not strategic for you moving forward. And it's just not the nature of the world. I tell parents and schools about the correlation that we have from research around when students feel better about themselves and have higher senses of belonging, that they do better in school. And no one says, Dr. Gay, that's political, what you're saying. And then we just have laws we have to abide to protect our students and others. There's child protection, and there's work we're doing around bullying. So again, when I begin to work with the community, I share these goals around the work, and nowhere around the world have parents said, what you've just said, I do not agree with. Now, if I come out of the gate and say, hello, I'm here to do diversity work, depending on where they fall on various spectrums, they may immediately buy in or not. So, one of the strategies to mitigate resistance is first to define the goals of what you're doing, and then to define terms in ways that everyone understands what we're talking about before then moving forward. And this takes time. This takes time. But once you have more people into the conversation, then you have more people who want to be engaged in the intentional work that we need to do to create these inclusive communities.
What I love about what you just said is that you're modeling inclusion and belonging in the way that you've come at talking about introducing this idea and helping people feel connected to it, and the understanding that everybody comes at it from a diverse perspective. And while we are diverse, we all deserve to be included and to feel like we belong. It's awesome. I love that you're walking the talk, so to speak, in what you were just saying. It's fantastic.
It's important, and also just this idea that we should expect different viewpoints, different experiences coming into this. And the metric or the barometer that we're going to use to really bring us together across those differences really is this idea in a school is the mission of the school, is that we're here to support all of our kids. And when we're thinking about which, you know, values, one is better than the other, no, in what way does moving forward with these mindsets, with these definitions, with these curricula, how does this support our children?
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision. So let's maybe look a little more specifically at strategies and activities that you would share with different stakeholders in a school community as you work with them while they seek to grow their intercultural competency.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think sort of the overarching framework for education around this work really is that ultimately has to be local, meaningful, relevant, and proximate, right? Just as learning to be meaningful has to be local, meaningful, relevant, and proximate, authentic learning builds on extant knowledge, but also you have to be able to connect with it somehow. So when I think about education and activities for various constituent groups, the framing has to make sense to that group. So the same type of content would look very different for a third grade assembly, as it were, than it would for a seventh grade advisory group, than it would for middle school teachers doing professional development, than it would for a board meeting, than it would for parents from the lower school. Same content would look drastically different because they're coming in with different perspectives and in some ways different outcomes, right? So I think about, for example, some of the work that I do with students. And really, with students, I have a couple of goals. One is to just increase their awareness around some of these dynamics, right? Positive dynamics and things that they are doing that drive inclusion and belonging, and things that they may be doing or unaware of that they're doing that are making a space where other students may not feel a sense of belonging. And then to give them, call them case studies, call them situations that are meaningful to them and help them walk through it. So, something that I'm seeing in all schools around the world are these pernicious jokes that students are telling. And they are jokes that are meant to be funny, and the punchline is predicated on someone's background, right? And it's often a stereotype about someone. It could be foods that they eat, or I mean, just all of these things. And again, the goal is to be funny, but what students are telling us also is that they're harmful, they're painful. Some of the things that students are telling me about, students using the N word, for example, around the world, students making monkey noises, students saying things like "that's so gay" to describe things that are only bad, right? Students making fun of people's religion, especially now with what's going on in the world, and putting themselves in camps around these things, making fun of how people look, their skin color, their weight, making fun if they're athletic or not. So these are jokes. So I asked the students, have you heard of these things happening? And they all give me a thumbs up. So now it's just become real. It's just become meaningful to this group. And then I support them and coach them. Don't tell them, coach them through leading them through essential questions and thinking about the consequences to their behaviors and actions around how other people are feeling a sense of belonging or not, to think about what are some strategies you can use moving forward. Am I saying that you shouldn't tell any jokes? No. So, how would you distinguish between a joke that is both funny and not hurting others, and a joke that might be offensive, and not only offensive, but make people feel as if they don't belong? Do you want to be the reason that someone feels this way? What do you do in these types of situations when you are the bystander? We've talked through these things. So, again, with students, it would be about creating situations and providing them with skills to navigate the difficult challenges while also using positive psychology to think about what type of person do you want to be and what are the positive attributes that you already have that you can leverage, right? That same type of workshop with a group of teachers and faculty and staff would look very different. It would be sharing with them what students have shared with me around what's happening, and then thinking about, as a teacher, what can you do in the classroom? How can you identify these situations? How can you preemptively provide students with content and capacity to mitigate these things from happening, but also to empower them when these things are happening in the classroom? How do you, as a teacher, engage in restorative justice when these things happen? To admit that these things have happened, identify that they have happened, speaking with students and helping them and educating them to engage in more inclusive behaviors, And then think about what are some techniques around repairing harm and cultivating trust in the classroom. That same workshop for parents, drastically different, right? How many of you have heard that these things are going on? Oh my goodness, right? Let me tell you what students have shared with me. Let me tell you some of the wonderful things we're doing in the classroom with teachers and faculty and staff. Now let's think about how we can partner with teachers and with the school. So, how do we build your capacity as a parent and as a caregiver to support this work that we're all engaged in to help students? Same workshop, but looking very different depending on the group that we're working with.
I'm going to do some Audrey speak here and just say that is so beautiful. It really is. And both Audrey and I were instructional designers, and I really appreciate starting with the students, starting with the case study, and then potentially into role play. Make it about experiential learning, make it about their lives, and then carrying that information out to the different people to help grow their awareness. And then, like you were saying, help them figure out how are they going to be a part of the solution. That is wonderful teaching. I really appreciate that approach. So, we're kind of talking about in the moment, tactical work. Let's look more strategically, I guess,
Mm.
for long term actions that schools can take. And I really appreciate your term interconnection when you take dignity, respect, inclusion, belonging, because they're all interconnected. And then when you bring in, just like you were talking about, when things are made aware of that are wrong and hurtful, where does the restorative justice practice, how does all that, as you said a little while ago, get embedded into the DNA of a school? And I know that's a super huge question, but if you can give it some kind of overview, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that schools need to do, and again, we're thinking strategically, and it has to be strategic to ensure that this work is sustainable. And it can't be viewed as an initiative, right? Something that we're going to do this year. We're going to talk about diversity and then we'll check it off the box and move on to sustainability or something else. And it can't only be at the tactical level, meaning that it's answering a discrete problem or a particular activity, but thinking about the series of policies and practices and other steps that we're going to move forward to move the institution and really ingrain this into the DNA of a school. So, first is just what we spoke about earlier. I believe is schools need to acknowledge the urgency of the issue and acknowledge the urgency of cultivating these inclusive mindsets with students at the earliest of ages and how this work is mission aligned. This isn't an agenda. This isn't political. This isn't a fad of the day. This is really the purpose of our schools. And when it becomes mission aligned, it gains a prominence and a saliency that allows us then to really operationalize it in all parts of the school. The second piece is to build capacity, particularly with those who are designing schools, to have a sense of, again, what are the issues? What are the problems we're solving for? What are the capacities that we need? What does the research say around this work? Then having some of these conversations that we had today around defining key terms, defining diversity, defining belonging, thinking about the motivations, why we engage in this work. And then you have to do some data collection. We talk about being data informed in our schools, and it has to be the same in this area. And I find that many schools still see diversity work as either touchy feely or either taking sort of hypotheses of what I think may be true, but I'm really not certain. And if you have this preconceived notion of diversity being only around certain groups, maybe feeling as if you can't even engage in the work because you don't belong to one of these groups, right? So, in realizing that this work is for everyone. We're compelled to do the work, and we need to get some data around where we are, as we would with any type of change management. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? Where do we see as the disjunctures? Where are we not aligned? And then creating a strategy to move the school. So that would be important. Then, just as we build capacity for designers, we have to build capacity for everyone in the school. It's not fair to expect that a teacher, in addition to being able to manage a classroom and to deploy curriculum and the like, also necessarily has the skill set around facilitation of these conversations, around integration of this content into the curriculum, etc. So there has to be professional development for all stakeholders around this work as well. And I think it's unfair to expect that a teacher just naturally has these abilities as part of their skill set. And what we know is, depending on how old you are, we didn't learn these things in school. Integrating diversity into the curriculum of the school is not part of the graduate school courses that many of us take. Increasingly, they are. So people are learning on the ground. And then the other piece is to really have, after we establish that this is mission aligned, after we build capacity of the leaders, after we have taken stock of where we are through data collection and understanding the gaps and where we want to go and building capacity, is to then actually create a plan. And this sounds intuitive, but I often find that we have plans around every other part of the school, but not around this work. And we conflate assemblies, I guess, or advisory group lessons, or the one off diversity day with a really proper comprehensive plan. So, thinking about again, what is the plan going to look like? What are a couple objectives that we're going to advance? Who's responsible? What's accountability look like? Monitor and track and really move this work along. And I've found that if you sort of follow the steps that I've outlined around really thinking about what change management looks like, and I say this because for many, this work should be inherent, meaning the idea that we want to create an inclusive environment for all of our students should be something that everyone is on board in, but everyone isn't inherently engaged or believe that to be true. So there does still have to be a strategy around it. And then once we think about what the strategy is, then as for any strategy, it's going to take time to implement. So there's some short-term things that you need to do, which is addressing the most egregious challenges, the most egregious harm that's happening in the school. We need to address this now. And then there's some more long term things that we can also think about as well. Because there's always, I find in this work, there's this tension between reconciling that there are issues that are going on right now that my students cannot wait for a 5-year plan for. And because it is change management, there are things that are going to take more time to implement, time to process, time to integrate. So it's not either it's the short term or it's the long term. How do you identify the low hanging fruit that you can begin to address now while also designing and implementing this more long term strategy to sustain the work?
So, the comments you were just making and the strategies you were describing remind me of the fact that both David and I had kids who, at one time or another, entered an international school as new students. And at those schools, the majority of the students were locals. And they'd been at the school since they were very young. They'd grown up together. So naturally, they were very close. They hung out together. They chatted together in the local language that they've always spoken together since they were really little. They had shared jokes, experiences, memories. They got along well. And just by default, by nature of the situation, our kids felt excluded. And it wasn't necessarily something that the local kids did. They just were very comfortable with each other. They had their groups, which could even be called cliques, although from my perspective, it wasn't necessarily intentional that they were excluding our kids. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. At the same time, as the newcomer, it's hard for David's sons and my daughter not to feel like, well, they just don't want me around. They don't like me. They have their own friends. They have their own activities, and I just don't belong. How do you approach that situation when you come to an international school and that is expressed as an issue?
Yeah, Audrey, I love that you mentioned this. And again, it gets to this idea of belonging 100%. And there isn't an international school that I've worked with where I haven't seen this dynamic. What's interesting about this, and it's a great case study. One is that, again, if you think about how important the linguistic framing is to this work, if you think, as many in international schools believe, that diversity only means LGBTQ plus. When you think about then issues that we need to address, this issue around linguistic inclusion would not come up. So people would not view this as, we're having issues around diversity. Let's talk about and address this. So, again, a really great example as to why linguistic framing is so important. Secondly, again, if we use this as a case study, in all of the schools, international schools I've worked with, and it's rare that you can say all and it not be a stereotype, but in every international school I've worked in, this during surveys, when we've had belonging surveys, this issue around linguistic inclusion has emerged as one of the top reasons why students feel included or not included. Meaning that, particularly in international school, often we say that English is the language of instruction in most international schools, and English is the language of inclusion, often we say as well, because it's a language of instruction. Most people, particularly by fourth, fifth, sixth grade, are proficient in English, right? But what we find is often the case in international schools is that English is the language of instruction, and the host country language is the social language. So that's important to note. And so then what are students saying? They're saying exactly what your kid said, that if I don't speak the host country language perfectly, then I can't get into the groups. And that the students of the host country typically have grown up together. And so their groups are very tight. So it's difficult to get into the group because I don't know them. And it's difficult to get into the group because the social language is a host country language and I just arrived. Students have also said that students will decide which language to speak when they want to talk about someone, knowing the languages that they can't speak. So we see this in international schools. So this is a language issue. So terrific. We have a broad definition of diversity that would capture this. We have a sense from the data collection, the surveys, the focus groups, we have a sense of what it looks like. And so then what have we done? So I'm thinking of schools where, one, we've had conversations with students and we've had focus groups and facilitated conversations with them to think about, in what context do you think we should be using the host country language? Because we also don't want to stigmatize the host country language. We also don't want people to feel as if they are outsiders in their own country. And I'm here at this country, I should be learning the host country language. But in what context in school are we going to use the host country language? And in what context in school are we going to use English, and why? In what ways do those choices advance a sense of belonging for students in our school? Now, that is a much more nuanced approach than me saying, David, you spoke in English, you're bad. Audrey, only speak this language, right? Stigmatizes, and then what students do is they sneak. They do whatever they're going to do when you're not around. But by engaging them in facilitated conversation, by essentially what you're doing is you're coaching them as opposed to consulting with them, right? So you're giving them essential questions as an inductive approach where, again, you are asking them questions and having them think about the choices they want to make and the impact of their choices around belonging and inclusion. And as a group coming together with some collaborative shared norms to then inform these inclusive behaviors. So it's a wonderful case study that thinks about all of these various components that we've spoke about today, ranging from how are we defining diversity, how is it different from belonging, how are we collecting data, how are we including student voice and agency in the issues that we're solving, and how are we bringing diverse viewpoints and experience together in ways that aligns with the mission of the school around fostering an inclusive school for all.
Well, I'm sure our kids would be very grateful to know that you're engaged in this kind of work. So thank you so much for going into that situation and really looking hard at how we can help people feel more included. It's such important work that you're doing.
It is, and I was mentioning off mic Doug Oda and his work around the world, helping schools, just as you're saying, grow their awareness and then building in the protocols and such to welcome people in and grow that sense of belonging. And so much of what we're discussing here is that self-awareness and then that awareness of how one interacts with others. And in the end, we talk about the portrait of a graduate. That's kind of a framework, it's been around forever. But I like that idea of if you're sitting down with parents and you say, what do you want to see the portrait of your child when your child graduates from this school? And like you're saying, they're not going to argue with you when you start talking about character strengths and having certain interest and awareness of others. This is a no-brainer, and this is, that's what we do in schools. We develop the whole child and prepare them for life. All right. With that said, let's stick a little bit more with international schools, and let's put on your prediction hat.
Hmm.
As you look down the road with DIB and growing this awareness and helping schools go through the change process, what are some things that you think are going to be happening with international schools?
Well, as I look into my crystal ball that only I have, by the way, some things I'm seeing seeds that are already planted and things I think will be happening. One is I know that this work around belonging is going to become even more deeply embedded into international schools. I'm seeing international school conferences, NISA and IRCOS and AMISA and CISA and all of our membership organizations. It's not just a one-time deal. It's not just that there's just one speaker in 1 year we're talking about diversity or belonging or intercultural competency. It's every year there's a keynote about it. It's every year there are workshops because school leaders and teachers care about these issues, and we're more aware of these issues in our international schools, and we want to do better. And so we want to learn, we want to grow, we want to increase capacity to foster more inclusive schools. So one trend I know is going to happen is that this is not going to be a diversity week or diversity month. This is going to be something that's going to be embedded into our schools. Something else that is happening and continuing to happen all around the world is just increased political polarization. It's around the world. This year, I believe there's over 50 national elections around the world, presidential elections. As we're becoming more politically polarized, the stakes for coming together, particularly around belonging in schools, is higher. And so, integrated into this work is also teachers in particular want to know, how do we foster respectful and meaningful civic discourse? How do we equip our students with conflict management skills? How do we begin at earlier ages to talk about respect and empathy, and not in broad ways? I'm also a senior advisor at Sesame Street, a curricular advisor there. And we talk about empathy as understanding and caring about the feelings of others. And we can't just say, Audrey, be nice to David, right? Be respectful. What does that actually mean? So, having explicit conversations with our students around lines of differences and how we are not going to judge people or have stereotypes or assumptions about people based on who they are, their backgrounds, and then teaching them that when there's conflict, how do we manage conflict in a way that we can create more inclusive environments? So that piece is a trend that definitely we're seeing in schools, and just this broader understanding of this work. Another trend that I'm seeing and I'm so appreciative of is international schools are leveraging pre-existing structures to integrate this work. So it's not as if now we have to create a new belonging program. No, you have an advisory program already. Integrate belonging into that. You have responsive classroom, integrate into that. You have SEL, integrate into that. You have character development, integrate into this. You have student assemblies, you have parent education, you have faculty development. You have all of these structures already in place. So as opposed to, creating a whole new something where teachers in particular are going to feel like you're adding more to my plate, think about how you can enhance the things that you're already doing to more intentionally align with this work. Those are some of the things I'm seeing.
So you're not singing opera, but I've got to say bravo. What you just said there is so much of what Audrey and I, in our experiences with initiatives, like you started us off with, the idea of taking what you already have, and then if you take the area of wellness and character strengths, just like you said, which overlaps with SEL, and you build on that. So that's wonderful.
I just have to say, I love that you brought in Sesame Street because back when I was a health and wellness teacher, one of the videos that I would play for students is the one with Mark Ruffalo and Elmo, I think it is, talking about
Yes, on
empathy.
empathy.
And I used to play it because it really did make sense. And I thought it was a fabulous way to define empathy for students. And I loved it. So I'm glad you brought that
Yes.
in. And I don't know if you were part of creating that, but that's a great little video.
So no, but Audrey, you have to know that that is one of my favorite videos, and I share that video all around the world about empathy. And you can only imagine, because you know that when I share that video with a assembly of kindergarten, first and second grade students, that they are so happy to do the empathy dance at the end.
Yeah, I bet. And, I also want to mention that as you were speaking and talking about all the different levels and aspects of this in the long term and so on, I was almost picturing, not that schools want or need any further forms of accreditation, and it would take a lot of investigating, a lot of time to discern whether a school was really living the full DIB experience. But I was sort of thinking about a governing body that could give some kind of certification, we are a DIB school. And, maybe that's not appropriate. It's just something that popped into my head as you were speaking.
Well, and the good thing is that many accrediting organizations are including a diversity portion into their assessment. The challenge, I think, is with our current accrediting structure is how do you codify what that looks like and then ensure that those who are coming to observe have an understanding themselves of actually what that looks like.
Right. That makes sense. So, you mentioned earlier schools of education, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of what they are offering. As you said, when some of us were training as teachers, they didn't mention this piece or train us in this. Do you know if they're doing it a little more intentionally at this point? And also, how could they do it? If you were the dean of a faculty of education, what would you propose?
That's a great question. And I know certainly, well, there are a couple of challenges to this question. One is that what we know is that there's just a stark difference in teacher preparation between independent school teachers and public school teachers, meaning that most independent school teachers did not begin teaching with a degree in education. They began teaching with a degree in their content area and learned the pedagogy and curriculum sort of in the independent school. So that's interesting. The exception to that, of course, is in elementary school. Most elementary school teachers have a background in pedagogy and a master's or something of that nature. So that's interesting. Then the second piece I think that is interesting is that so in the last couple of years, I also lectured a few universities around this work, Parsons Paris, International Fashion Academy, Klingenstein program at Columbia University. And I'm seeing, particularly from some of the younger students, and of course, younger depends on how old I am, but when I say 30 and younger, in their undergraduate programs, liberal arts, whatever it is, they've taken some type of course, most of them, that touches on some of the aspects of diversity. And I'm seeing more education schools intentionally integrating some type of training and classes around this to various, I mean, there still isn't codification around it, but that students in education schools are, I think, more aware and having more tools certainly than we did. What I am teaching in schools, in the courses I'm teaching, is a lot of what I've spoken about today about the importance of having sort of linguistic clarity around what we mean by diversity in ways that drive belonging. And that's, in fact, one of the courses I teach. It's called Reframing Diversity to Drive Belonging. And the second piece that's important in those courses is not only content knowledge, but also some introspection around self and understanding teacher positionality. and how your background certainly informs what you teach and how you teach it. And then the ongoing work of just developing concrete skills to integrate mirrors and windows into the curriculum, right? In ways that all students see themselves, the mirrors, but also learn about different perspectives of others as a way of scaffolding empathy. And then also just ongoing education as instructors to think about various instructional practices where we can foster the type of psychological safety that we need to engage in these conversations and ensure that we're creating spaces where all students feel a sense of belonging. And then the final piece I think that would be really important in the courses I'm teaching is really to then apply all of the concepts and the frameworks into real case studies. And so I have with many of the schools I'm working with, we take case studies and I've created a case study protocol to just walk them through how do you process this, do some constituent mapping, sort of what are the various perspectives and values at play here, and then thinking about what does empathy look like, what does effectiveness look like in this situation, and then thinking about what are some strategies you can employ to navigate this. So again, the education piece, the awareness piece, the identity piece, the specific sort of curricular and instructional practice piece, and then just the application piece in particular are the key components of the courses that I design for students.
So we can only hope that our schools of education out there are incorporating some aspects of what you're talking about. And I know one of the broader themes right now, at least in the US, is we need to get more teachers coming into these schools of education. But that's a whole nother podcast interview. So it's been wonderful for you to teach us about some of the approaches. And I know we're just going across the surface of what you bring to schools and organizations and nonprofits. So if folks want to follow your work, how can they find out more about you, Dr. Gay?
Yeah, a couple of ways. One certainly is my website, and we try to update that weekly with just new information and sharing some of the work that I'm doing in schools around the world. There's a blog component to that. There's a resources component to that. There's all the podcasts I'm doing. So this podcast will be there. Articles that I'm writing are all there. So a repository of information for folks. The next place where I'm probably most prevalent is LinkedIn. So I try to post there things that I'm doing and articles and resources for folks as well. And then particularly for international educators and international schools, I've just started an international schools diversity podcast. And we have about 5 podcasts up there, specifically thinking about what these issues look like in the international education space. So those are on the website, but also you can access those. And then I have an Instagram where I publish all of the amazing food that I'm eating from all around the world. And it's called The Bald Foodie. And so the_bald_foodie. And I just post lots of pictures of paella and pupusas and kalpi and you name it, just incredible Hong Kong noodles and you name it, because I eat too much. And I want to share that with the world as well. So, and also I have on that same site, I have some excerpts of me singing at schools around the world. So lots of ways to find the work. And I look forward to connecting with people and hearing their perspectives and being in community with people. And, I'm so grateful to be here, David and Audrey, just as much, I hope, that you've learned from me. I think I've learned tons just by your really thoughtful questions. It allows me an opportunity to synthesize all of my thoughts, and your questions have pushed me in positive ways as well. So thank you for that.
Well, I think it's so exciting that you're doing a podcast because that's a way that people can get into it for the long haul. As you said, you've condensed everything down here, and it'll give you the opportunity to meet it out bit by bit so that people can take it in and really digest it and apply it. So I think a podcast by you is a fantastic idea, and we will definitely check it out. What was the name of it? I didn't catch a name for it.
We just changed the name, but I believe the name is Diversity in International Schools.
Well, honestly, what a pleasure it has been to meet you and chat with you, and you have a beautiful heart. Please keep sharing that and including everyone and making sure they feel seen and that they belong. We both do right now. I'm sure I speak for David as well. We really appreciate you joining us on the podcast. And as I say, we're going to follow yours. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for the invitation. I hope this is the first of several opportunities we have to engage in these conversations.
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah. We're getting you back there, Dr. Gay. We have a lot more questions for you. So thank you.
Looking forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's Audrey.
And David.
We're so happy and grateful that you're here listening to us. We really want to thank the people who follow us on Apple Podcasts and have written reviews. We appreciate you guys.
We hope to increase our reach within the international education community, so we are asking for your help. Please follow our show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast listening app. We have posted instructions on how to do this on our podcast page.
If you like our show and the services we aim to provide, please rate us and write a review. This will help us grow our audience and support our mission of sharing the joys of international teaching with as broad a group as possible. We'd love to increase those numbers in Africa, South America, and Australia.
So thanks again for listening and for all your support. Let's recruit as many teaching peeps as possible to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.